just to give us an example of the kind of argumentation that's been used. Just recently, Mr. Matitix brought up the subject of Jesus' parables and the chief steward that is referred to in the parables in Matthew. And he asked me, Mr. White, who is the chief steward? Well, Mr. Matitix, this is called a parable. And you don't need a specific fulfillment of that individual. It's interesting to me that the Jehovah's Witnesses use the same passage about the faithful and discreet slave and identify their organization as a firm, unflinching proof that the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society is Jehovah's only organization. Exact same methodology of interpretation. You don't use parables and say, well, who's this chief steward in this parable? Well, it must be Peter, and it must be then the papacy and the successors of Peter and the bishops of Rome. Where did Jesus say that? It's not there. And Mr. Matitix just gave us, and I hope you caught, what I believe is literally a subtle attack upon the sufficiency of Scripture. Did you hear what he said? He said that there is an addition to Scripture in the teaching authority of the Roman Catholic Church. An addition to Scripture. To use his very own words. I wrote them down and quoted them. We have to attack the sufficiency of Scripture this evening because the simple fact of the matter is that if you take sola scriptura, and if you take the Scriptures alone, as we are supposed to do this evening, they do not lead you to the papacy. Unless you have this overriding consideration, they don't lead you to the papacy. Now, Mr. Matitix speaks of his personal experience. But Mr. White, what about me? Well, Mr. Matitix, what about the thousands who went the other direction? Is your personal experience and the personal experience of other men that I know who have looked at the exact same passages and come to the exact opposite conclusion of you supposed to be determinative of what I as a Christian am supposed to submit to as an authority? I'm sorry, sir. It is not. It is not and cannot be. Mr. Matitix asked me, why does Jesus call Peter rock? And I'll answer very briefly, because Peter became a rock by the grace of Christ after having proven over and over and over again that in and of himself he was a pebble. And boy, that sure encourages me when I feel like a pebble, that I can know by Peter's example that I can be a rock, but only by the grace of Christ. Mr. Matitix just presented to us the argument from authority. The argument from authority. He who hears you hears me. Yes, that's true. My friends, how do we hear the apostles? How do we hear the apostles? This is where we hear the apostles. Oh, but Mr. Matitix says, we also hear the apostles in their successors. And I say, well, that's an interesting claim. But how do I test it? Because it's not just Mr. Matitix claiming that he has people who speak to the apostles. The Mormons make the same claim. The Jehovah's Witnesses have this authority as Jehovah's only organization. How do I test it when they claim it? Because he who speaks as a successor of the apostles speaks in harmony with this word. That's how you test. That's how you know. But Mr. Matitix is basically telling us, well, see, the reason that the Roman Catholic papacy is correct is because the Roman Catholic Church is the Church of Christ, and it says so. That's really what the argument from authority is. It's a very tight circle. It's a very tight circle. And that wasn't the argument this evening. The argument this evening is not what does Rome teach the New Testament teaches, because we already know that. My opening statement, I defined that for you from Vatican I, and if that was the extent of the debate, then we could have gone home right at that point. We know that Rome says, we are the church, we have the authority to tell you what the New Testament teaches. The debate this evening is, what does the New Testament teach? That is the question. Mr. Matitix brought up Galatians chapter 2, and the fact that I had said, well, Peter is specifically defined as the apostle to the Gentiles. And Mr. Matitix says, well, that doesn't mean that he didn't have the primacy. That does not mean that the Gentiles were not under his jurisdiction as Pope. Folks, can you hear that? Do you hear what's going on in that interpretation? What is the overriding assumption? If you come to Galatians chapter 2 and derive your theology from Galatians chapter 2 only, what are you going to get? Are you going to get support for the papacy? Are you going to see Peter functioning as the universal head of the church? No. But what does Mr. Matitix do? He says, well, it doesn't mean that he didn't. Where are we getting our authority? Where are we getting our interpretation? Are we getting it from the text? Or do we have an overriding assumption that we are then enforcing upon the text? I think that's what we have going on here when we look at Galatians chapter 2. And Mr. Matix keeps talking about, he says, go to the library, and Protestant scholars will say that Peter has the preeminence in the Gospels. Did anyone hear me say that? I did. But I said there is a huge leap from having a preeminence in the Gospel to a primacy over the universal church, which has successors in the Bishop of Rome. There is a huge difference between those two things. And you can look at all the Protestant commentaries in the world, and that's not going to mean that because Peter is the apostle we hear most of in the New Testament, that means that the Bishop of Rome is the vicar of Christ on earth and head of all Christians. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about huge leaps. And that is a huge leap. Now, Mr. Matitix said that I hold to idiosyncratic views that were popular at the time of the Reformation. Now, I hope you'll come out tomorrow night, because the specific thing he was talking about was the majority view of the early church for 5 centuries. His is the minority view, and I'll prove it tomorrow night. Idiosyncrasy? Only if you could say that the entire majority of the early church was engaging in idiosyncrasies, which sort of strips the meaning right out of the term idiosyncrasy. Then we spent 4 or 5 minutes talking about contraception, humane vitae, and how nice a man the popes can be. And I'm sure he's a nice man. I don't know. I have it on good evidence this morning. I heard Guido Sarducci on the radio saying he was a nice man, so I guess that means he was a nice man. That's certainly enough evidence for me. I don't know. But what does that have to do with the debate this evening? He says, well, there have been bad popes, but those bad popes never changed teaching. Oh, au contraire, mon ami. Innocent, for example, not Innocent III, but the Innocent that immediately preceded the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, Sibo, openly embraced his illegitimate children and gave them unheard of riches and bishoprics in the church, elevated them to positions of authority within the church. Julius used indulgences to enrich himself. What are indulgences? Indulgences are selling, at that time, the remission of the temporal punishments of sins for money. And Julius did it. If that isn't teaching, I don't know what is. Alexander VI, as a cardinal, sold forgiveness for money, saying God did not want the sinner's death, but that he live and pay. And he then used the money he collected as years in his position as a cardinal to buy the papacy and become Alexander VI. That doesn't have to do something with teaching.